Alright, so today we're going to talk a bit about the principles of historical critical exegesis and about a few of the types of biblical criticism that have arisen due to these principles. So the first and primary principle is the principle of doubt. And this has a lot to do with the Age of Enlightenment and all of these new discoveries happening that really challenge traditional understandings of the world. Of course, Descartes was a huge influence on the idea of doubt being a fundamental approach to any subject. And so that's the starting point for inquiry and discovery, is doubt. And this goes hand in hand with the principles of perspicuity and right reason. So we could start with doubt only because of the idea of right reason, i.e., anyone using reason in an appropriate logical manner can come to unity and understanding of the world around them, the Bible included. So really no longer a true recognition of the limits of reason, but rather if Scripture is perspicuous, i.e. if anyone reading it can understand it, if we don't need the church or other people to interpret it for us, but rather it's for all men to understand, then using right reason, the true meaning of Scripture can be discovered. And it's also the idea that there's one single literal meaning, which is the next point. The focus of historical critical exegesis is really the single literal meaning of the human author. And by literal meaning, it really ends up becoming the original meaning. So what that author of this text of Scripture, this passage, whatever, was trying to communicate to their original audience. So the focus really becomes, what did this author mean at this time for this people? What was the message that they were trying to convey? And really it pushes out the idea of the spiritual sense, and the focus is reconstructing the original historical occasion for the text and thinking that that will give us the true meaning of the text. And so the next principle is definitely a loss of spiritual senses, right? Essentially, all we're focusing on is this original intent of this human author. And so there's no fuller meaning to the text apart from what the author originally meant to their original audience. So clergymen, Bible people, whatever, can apply the texts, but that ought not get confused with the original true meaning of the passage of Scripture. And all of this focus on human author, on right reason, it all led to viewing Scripture as uninspired and diverse, as opposed to the idea of Scripture that was held for centuries beforehand, that it had a unity in theology and in scope, right, and in purpose. Now, for historical critical exegesis, it's the exact opposite. Not only is there only one literal meaning but it's the biblical documents are uninspired and diverse, and so it's a rejection of divine inspiration. No longer is it a divine book for the church or a rule for faith and practice, but really it's just all of these it's a collection of human documents that humans just put together instead of the work of God, the work of the Spirit, kind of bringing it all together. It's this idea that these books are uninspired and just all over the place. The next section, then, following logically, is that when we approach Scripture, we ought to be free from dogma, free from tradition. Tradition should have no influence in exegesis, especially if we're using right reason and believe in the perspicuity of Scripture. So the Bible was no longer a book for spiritual guidance, but really just relegated to a bunch of ancient documents collected by people, which means that it's fallible, right, because it's no longer viewed as being divinely inspired, and really not important for philosophy or theology, because again, that's what tradition says. And so we're coming to the book without tradition, already assuming that it's uninspired and diverse. This also was influenced largely by the fact that the setting for this exegesis is really focused in the university, as opposed to focusing in the church within the clergy or leadership there. And so academically claims that what's narrated in the text is not really what is not really what's true. And so we have to look behind the texts in order to find the true meaning of Scripture, all relegated to academics and to the historical development of these books. And so really leaving true interpretation outside of the church and in the academic realm. And because of all of this right reason, because we're approaching things with doubt, we're free from dogma, it's uninspired bunch of human documents, now we get to the irrelevance of the virtue of the person looking at the scriptures. And so the character and virtue of the interpreter are no longer relevant because it's no longer a spiritual exercise to engage in biblical exegesis, but really it's an academic exercise in doubt and in looking for the true meaning of Scripture or of these documents, the true meaning of these documents that's really to be found looking at them historically. And so from all of these different principles, we arise different kinds of criticism: source criticism, redaction criticism, and form criticism. Now, source criticism is the oldest of all of these methods, came around 17th, 18th century, and really the goal for source criticism is to identify discrepancies and find their sources, and to sort of try to date these sources that gave way to the texts in their final form that we have in the Bible, trying to link those sources to historical and geographical regions. And so this is when we get like the JEDP type delineations for sources of the Pentateuch, things of that nature. And this is really came from the rise of people taking a look at Scripture, at these documents, and noticing apparent contradictions, repetitions, doublets, etc., and saying, oh man, these are best explained by thinking that the text is composite in nature. It's not all one uniform text, but rather it was taken from these sources and these sources and these sources and then made into a single text. Okay, then we also have redaction criticism, which this seeks the historical and theological ideas of a writer by looking at what was put in to their writings and what was left out, right? So it focuses on the author's use, disuse, or alteration of the traditions that they had available to them. So we're looking at the books in their final form and shape and how they're written, and from that trying to determine what their theological ideas or points were, which goes hand in hand with form criticism, which also all of this is built on the idea of the composite nature of Scripture. And really form criticism, you're trying to identify formal elements in a composition. So it goes hand in hand with literary criticism, but a tad bit different because literary criticism focused on these books as a whole, where form criticism is really trying to analyze the literary forms to track the historical development of traditions and how they came to be in their final form in Scripture. And so it's trying to rediscover the history of the individual blocks of texts, which in light of the tradition and in light of the literary form. So really the task of form criticism was to go a bit beyond literary criticism and use these literary forms to trace the historical development of the text into their final form. And so that was just a real brief take on the principles of historical criticism and historical critical exegesis and the types of criticism that came with the rise of those principles.